last week we were talking about how this growth of debt is a threat to our national security. And what are your thoughts on that? Why is this unconstrained growth of debt a threat to national security?
Well, we have a debt level comparable to what we had at the end of World War II, and we haven't been in a war. And we might be in one soon. Maybe not necessarily a hot war, but cold wars are expensive too. And to defend yourself, you need to be able to ramp up quickly. That takes fiscal space. And if we have any left at all, it isn't much.
And I know you mentioned the increasing in interest rates is really hammering us in terms of the cost of servicing the debt.
Yeah, it is. We attended a meeting, the American Legislative Exchange Council, a couple of years ago, in which we heard, can't remember if it was one or two defense officials, an admiral and a general, I believe, tell us what's obvious to us wonky people, namely that the number one national security debt issue is how deep in debt we are, and not only does it impair existing defense spending, but it does impair our ability to increase it rapidly should that need arise. And frankly, for those of you listening, we're doing this on June 28th, 2024, the day after the Biden Trump debate, in which we basically told world leaders that our president is not high functioning. And so that means, that's a defense risk for sure. Democrat or Republican, when you tell bad people that you're not well prepared to fight them, sometimes they attack. So yeah, so we're in, as George H.W. Bush said, we're kind of in deep doo-doo and got our fingers and toes and arms and everything else crossed for getting through another 6 months till a higher functioning president can take over.
Yeah, and the number that hit me was the interest cost on the debt is now exceeds defense spending. So that's sort of an indication of how much of this crowding out is going. We just don't have the resources now to devote to defense, and we certainly don't have that fiscal space, as you say, that you need whenever you have a military conflict. The thing that I've been trying to figure out is why has this occurred over the last couple of decades? And as we've talked about, in the 1990s, it looked like we were doing pretty well. The end of the Cold War, we cut military spending, we balanced the budget. And in my view, there are two problems here that are important. And one is that simply how we're defining emergencies. We used to historically define emergencies very narrowly as a military conflict. But when you go to war, you incur deficits. And then when peacetime, you run surpluses. And that's pretty much, that happened really right up through the 1990s. Now everything's an emergency. All the spending that they increased in the financial crisis in 2008, and of course the COVID money, that emergency money is now permanent expenditures. And I guess more fundamentally, we've become sort of a transfer society in which more and more of the government spending is in transfer programs that are automatic, Social Security, Medicare, and so forth. And even now we're defining education relief, debt relief for students. That's another entitlement spending, and it's permanent. It's not temporary. And I think we talked about how Friedman said a miracle happened after the Second World War. We transitioned from a military defense economy to a peacetime economy, and we did it. Markets did it very efficiently. We're not doing that anymore. We're not letting markets allocate resources.
Yeah, people are talking about socialism, but what we're doing, if anything, is crony capitalism, which has another ugly name, fascism. But back to the defense thing, what we're doing now is unsustainable. The level of debt and deficit and interest rates are rising, the debt's rising. So the interest payments, which as you noted, are already above what we're spending on defense, which, if that doesn't show a vulnerability, I'm not conversant at all in what does. History has frowned very deeply on when you spend more on interest than you spend on defense. And so that's going to get worse before it gets any better. And that's one of the reasons we need a fiscal rule to cap the growth in spending and to force cuts in some spending, because as for example, defense needs go up. If you capped overall spending growth, you have to cut other things. And that's the only way Congress cuts anything, is if there's a gun to their head and they have to cut it, and there's no way to find the money to increase spending. And one of the few silver linings we have to this cloud, hopefully, if we're well prepared for when we get to that edge of that fiscal cliff, closer than we already are, is hopefully we can cut some things that the federal government doesn't have any business doing. And that doesn't mean that they shouldn't be done by the government, but it isn't in the Constitution. If anything, it's been imagined by past Supreme Courts. If those things are worth doing, they're worth doing by states, things like education, housing, urban development. Those are things that we need a cap on spending growth in order to be able to cut those, in order to make room for things like increasing interest payments and the number one federal responsibility, defending us against all the bad actors that always seem to be around. There's more than enough of them right now.
Yeah, and what's scary to me is nobody's talking about this other than you and me in these podcasts. We may be talking to ourselves. As I was so upset with the debate last night, I turned it off. I couldn't stomach it. It was a terrible, terrible debate as far as I'm concerned.
Oh.
Not a single discussion of debt burdens, spending cuts, and so forth. It's almost like we've given up. We've thrown in the towel. And you and I haven't thrown in the towel. We're looking for countries that have solved this debt problem, like Switzerland. And as you say, the answer seems to be some effective rules in the Constitution that prevent the Congress from this discretionary spending that's just driving us over the cliff. But nobody's listening. That's the scary thing.
It is scary. It's the vast majority of people have no idea that we are sleepwalking over the edge of a cliff. And I use the term sleepwalking because George Will put that out there and he nailed it. I mean, that's exactly what's going on. And the few people that I'm able to personally make aware of this, hopefully we'll do better through these podcasts. They're just in total denial. It just goes up right. I can tell them that we're going to soon be spending a third of our revenue on interest. And what little is left will go to Social Security and Medicare, leaving almost nothing for actually operating the federal government, unless we keep adding to the debt, which means unless the borrowers or the lenders, the bond buyers, keep buying, and the rising interest rates show that the bond buyers are getting more and more concerned about our ability to pay that money back with equal purchasing power, because the number one danger is hyperinflation from printing too much money, because then both we get the crash and the inability to borrow in the future or anywhere in the near future to meet sudden defense needs.
Yeah, and there are a lot of crazy people out there. Modern monetary theorists basically say, well, we can just print as much money as we need. We don't have to worry about it because it's the money we owe ourselves, or it's our own currency and we have a reserve currency. It's nonsense. This stuff is just crazy economics that doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, anybody who's seen the growth of money causing inflation over the last couple of years, and then how we're still trying to cope with inflation, how can they argue that, oh, you just print more money? I mean, people are fed up with a 10% inflation. What are they going to do with a 20% or a 50%, like Argentina, or 100? What is Argentina's inflation rate? It's hundreds of percent, and people give up. They throw in the towel. The government can't function, and I think we're close to that. If I sound rabid, there are a lot of crazy people out there we need to respond to.
Right. There's already more than enough money sitting in places that are kind of tied up, in foreign places where they're using dollars as currency, and in Federal Reserve excess reserve accounts. I know we're getting a little wonky for some of our audience, but that money is all tied up. And if the Fed stops being able to pay interest on reserves, or if foreigners lose confidence in the dollar, there's already more than enough dollars in existence to cause those high rates of inflation if we print more on top of that to meet our interest payments, you know, we're looking at the worst case scenario where the bond buyers go away because they won't accept inflated dollars as repayment. I mean, they'll accept them, but they won't make that mistake twice. They won't keep making their money available to us. And then people can buy all the gold in the world that they want to against inflation, but in hyperinflation, all the supply chains break down, and there's no defense against that. We are dependent on each other. Hardly anybody is self-sufficient for their food and housing needs. And if those supply chains break down because people can't figure out what to charge for something or what they can get paid for it, yeah,
And we're already seeing a decreased willingness of foreigners to hold the dollar as a reserve currency. But I have a suggestion. I think I call it, this is my Hail Mary solution. Let's bring Milei, the Argentine president, the first one who was able to cut spending here, back to the U.S. and see if we can have somebody like that who's basically saying, you know, you finally reach a point where what's your favorite terminology? Something that it can't go up indefinitely is going to come down, and that's sort of where we are, and that's where they are. I mean, I think in Argentina, when your inflation rate gets to be 200, 300, 400% per year, I mean, you throw in the towel and you start over again. And maybe that's where we are. We need somebody to send that message.
that's right. I mean, they were able to borrow from the International Monetary Fund. Most of that money comes from us, so that's not a place where we can go.
No, we can't rely on that. Well, John, I think we've given them enough of the dismal science today, and maybe we can upset enough people so we're not just talking to ourselves anymore. And I think that the national security issue is a very important and crucial problem. And my good friend Bill Owens, who is Admiral Owens, has said that this debt issue is the most crucial threat to our national security. Others have said that as well. But I think we're beginning to see this, and foreign countries are beginning to see this as well. So maybe we should end this dismal science and try again next week.
Well, we should. Well, we'll make it in a couple of weeks. And let me finish on this note. When I talk about this issue or when I see people write about it, they often say we're doing terrible things to our grandkids. And that may be so, but this is going to hit way, 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 way before your grandkids, unless you're really old and they're already adults. This is going to hit in a year or 2 or 3 or 4 because we can't keep adding debt to higher interest rates with all these bad actors out there in the world. Something's going to break. It's not sustainable what we're doing. It will end. It's only a question of whether it'll end badly or reasonably based on advanced preparation, which folks, please come to policytalk.org and join with the Institute for Objective Policy Assessment to hopefully prevent us from going over the fiscal cliff. But if we do go over, have it be a managed plummet.
Okay. See you next week.
See you soon.